From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made 40 years ago, the 1980 election. It was an entirely different set of political coalitions, so different that we might not recognize it today. In 1980, consider the 100 American counties with the highest share of college graduates. Republicans dominated among college grads, winning 76%. In 2020, Democrats won even bigger with college graduates, taking 84% of the votes in those counties. Back in 1980, Democrats were winning in rural America and rarely winning in the wealthiest enclaves. In fact, Republicans won 91 of the 100 wealthiest counties in 1980. This year, Democrats won a clear majority of the richest areas, and Democrats won all 20 of the largest cities, some by 60 points. Maybe you're thinking, so what? Things have changed. Change is part of life. Well, our goal in the coming weeks is to examine how Republicans can once again convince voters to vote for them in large cities and how Democrats can once again convince voters to vote for them in rural America. But this situation is a bigger issue for Democrats, as Derek Thompson writes in a new piece for The Atlantic titled Why Big City Dominance is a Problem for Democrats. Thompson writes, quote, "The GOP currently holds both Senate seats in Alaska, Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Those 11 states have 22 senators who collectively represent fewer than the population of California, which has 2 Senate seats. This problem is only going to get worse. One analysis of Census Bureau data projected that by 2040, roughly half of the population will be represented by 16 senators. The other, more rural half will have 84 senators at their disposal. If Democrats don't find a way to broaden their coalition into less populous states with smaller metro areas, it may be impossible to pass liberal laws for the next generation," end quote. So how can Democrats win outside the cities and the suburbs again? Thompson writes that Democrats need to learn to tune out the most extreme voices in the party, the voices that tend to be young and extremely online. And he points to complaints from members of Congress, like Congressman Vicente Gonzalez, a Democrat from South Texas, who won by 20 points in 2018, but barely won re-election this time around. Gonzalez said, quote, "Defund police, open borders, socialism, it's killing us." Well, to be clear, he's not saying that Democrats want socialism. He's saying they're getting crushed in the narrative and communications game. One of the few places that Democrats have made serious strides in rural areas is Kansas. Journalist Sarah Smarsh says that Kansas Democrats don't get bogged down by the culture wars, and instead they focus almost entirely on economic inequality and the pain that families in poverty are feeling. Our guests all have experience in Democratic politics in rural areas. I will welcome them now. Jerry Lynn Sparks is a former congressional press secretary, founder of the Riga Democratic Committee. And where did you grow up, Jerry Lynn Sparks?
I grew up in the rural foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina.
I always thought you were faking your accent. It's the real deal.
It pretty much. They think I sound city now that I've lived in New York for 20 years.
Oh, you're such a Yankee. Jerry, welcome back to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Hello to Leslie Danks Burke, who is a regional public advocate, former candidate for New York State Senate. Leslie, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much for having me. Good to hear you.
And Sean Hogan is the former mayor of Hornell and current chair of the Steuben County Democratic Committee. Sean, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you.
I'm going to just start by asking all three of you if you agree that the current political landscape is a problem for Democrats. I'll start with you, Jerry. What do you think?
I do think it's a problem. I live in the rural area of Rochester, actually. I live in Churchville, and I have, I think it's like 2-to-1 for party registration, and there's people in my neighborhood, and they basically ask me all the time with puzzled looks on their face, like, why are you a Democrat? They don't believe that the Democratic Party platform represents their interests, and they really feel that it's elitist and out of touch. And when I try to explain, the values that we have in the Democrat Party, because I am a member of our Democratic Committee, they say, that they think I'm a nice person, they think I'm in the wrong party, and that the party doesn't represent them. And I think you see that as the feeling across the country. My mother and father are just astonished that I'm a Democrat, basically from the way I was raised in like farmland. And I think that's really the part that I've seen in a lot of articles online in preparing for today's call. You see that rural America feels like Democrats don't offer anything for their actual lived experience.
Leslie Danks Burke, what do you think?
I have a lot of the same experience. I go and talk with groups of people about my views and beliefs and the agenda that I was seeking to bring to the district I was running for state senate to represent. And I would hear back from folks over and over, well, why are you running as a Democrat then? I don't think you represent the Democratic Party. I consider myself very much a Democrat. I'm a very proud Democrat. I'm a Democrat of the FDR persuasion. I believe in FDR's principles of freedom from want and freedom from need, and that we need to get to those principles. I think that's a pretty progressive agenda, but it's not the agenda that folks in rural communities are hearing advertised as the Democratic agenda. And so I think the Democrats have a messaging problem. I don't think they have a platform problem. I think we've got the right set of policies that we're advancing. We're just packaging it up the wrong way, and folks don't recognize it as Democrat when they hear about it.
Well, and let me just ask you, let me just follow that point with you, Leslie. I mean, you just ran for New York State Senate, so it sounds to me like you felt like you were running against a Republican opponent and you were running against a narrative of what people were told you are as opposed to what you are. When you are talking to people, to the extent that you could go door to door, at least talking to people in various ways throughout this year, how did you handle those conversations? I mean, what were some of the common things you were hearing from voters?
Well, I'll just say that every single person that I actually got a chance to talk with, or that my team got a chance to talk with, we converted them to vote for me. It's just
not every person. Every person.
Listen, I got to tell you, every single phone call that I got on where I actually got to talk with the person, the phone call ended with, "Sure, I'll vote for you." I swear to God. You just cannot talk to every single person in a district. And that becomes problematic, especially in a pandemic when you can't go door to door. I don't think that's about me as a candidate in particular. I think I was a pretty good candidate, but I don't think that, I'm some sort of superstar who's able to persuade everybody. I think the Democratic messaging is I think it's the right platform. I think that exactly as you put it, Evan, what people are told Democrats stand for is not accurate, and it's destroying the party.
Sean, what do you think?
Well, having been an elected official for 32 years as a small city upstate mayor, I agree. I mean, I was successful in putting forth I think, very good leadership for a number of years and had great many successes, economic developmentally and socially, and improving the quality of life for our citizens here. Unfortunately, our Republican friends on the other side of the aisle are much better at, framing the issues and pushing the messaging than the Democrats have been. Whether it was on bail reform or the SAFE Act in upstate New York, the defund the police, democratic socialism, all that sends a scary message to upstate voters. And we have to do better at beating that back. Francis Perkins, who was the FDR's labor secretary, had a simple message. And that message was a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best life possible. And that was our message at Democrats, whether you were in big cities or you were in rural America. And a lot of the programs the Democrats have championed over the years, Social Security, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, rural electrification, they all benefit upstate to a greater degree than they did some of our larger metropolitan areas. We talk about our agriculture as being the number one business in New York State. Without rural electrification, which was promoted by FDR and the Democrats, there would be no agriculture in upstate New York. So we have to go back to where we began and develop our message about what we've accomplished as a party for our citizens, and also the message that we're here not to control your lives, but to try to make your lives better when we can. And that's a simple message, but it's one that needs to be heard by the vast majority of voters that have abandoned the Democratic Party in upstate New York.
I want to read a couple. Oh, is that you, Jerry? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I to a small extent, I disagree with your other two speakers, because it's not just a messaging problem. There are some things that the Democrats have failed to do in their actions. You know, it's one thing to say you have a messaging problem, and I agree that we do have a messaging problem, but there's got to be weight behind that message. And we have, as a party, and even, you know, everyone loves President Obama, he also didn't follow through on some of the things he said for allowing mergers and corporations and allowing agribusiness to grow. So there's been this depletion of protecting small businesses in the actions of the person, you know, that was at the head of the Democratic ticket. And it really hurt rural America, having the growth of agri-farms and these large corporations that took away small businesses. Republicans have capitalized on the small business, even with the COVID-19 and the money from the government. You know, you find a lot of the problem is not just the messaging, it's the actions.
So,
well, you know, I'm going to agree that there have been members of the Democratic Party who have not followed through on the actions. But that doesn't mean it's not there in the platform. And I agree with you. I'm deeply concerned about what's happening to agriculture, with the Democrats and Republicans propping up big agricultural corporations at the expense of our local dairy farms and our local businesses. But, you know, the stereotypical right-left spectrum that elites like to focus on, I don't think it really exists anymore. There's no way Republicans are conservative today. They spend money like it's going out of style. They're funneling corporate welfare at a dizzying rate. They're raising regular people's taxes through the roofs. And so, you know, we need to, as Democrats, recognize that we're fighting against a Republican message that self-defines themselves as conservative when they aren't at all. And we've got to recognize that the folks on our side who perhaps strike deals with the Republicans that create problems like you're describing, Jerry Lynn, are not necessarily fighting against conservatism.
Well, if I could, let me at least get two very different perspectives on what Democrats can do and what they ought to focus on. And then I'm going to ask all three of our guests to not only respond to the two very different perspectives, but to talk about the specific issues in a little bit more detail here that will start to perhaps move the needle. First of all, this is from Leonard, who writes the following. Evan, I spent 2 months this year in rural South Dakota taking care of my parents. I went to the grocery store wearing an N95 mask at 7 a.m. on Sundays to avoid people who couldn't be convinced that a global pandemic was real. For these people, and they are the majority in South Dakota, only Fox News and right-wing memes on Facebook represent the truth. Everything else is a liberal plot. If you cannot convince people to wear a little piece of cloth on their face and stay home from the bar to save their lives and the lives of others, convincing them to vote for a Democrat is absolutely a bridge too far. Maybe your guests have a solution to this problem, but from where I sit, the solution is to forget about rural states that are too far gone and concentrate on states with enough minority and young new voters to flip the legislatures and the federal offices. These include Arizona, Georgia, Texas. Thank you. That's from Leonard. Here's a very different view, though. This comes from Bill Hogseth, who is the chair of the Dunn County Democratic Party in Wisconsin. He wrote a piece for Politico titled "Why Democrats Keep Losing Rural Counties Like Mine." And he says the following, quote, "Trust is earned slowly. It can't be earned back with campaign slogans or TV ads. When people feel left behind, they look for a way to make sense of what is happening to them. There is a story to be told about rural America, yet Democrats are not telling it. That leaves an opening for other stories to be told to fill the vacuum, stories that villainize and divide us along racial, geographic, and partisan lines. That is the story Trump told, but it's the wrong one. The real story is that rural people feel our way of life is being sold off. We see the wealth of our sweat and soil being sent away to enrich executives, investors, and shareholders. For Democrats to start telling a story that resonates, they need to show a willingness to fight for rural people, not just by proposing a, quote, rural plan or showing up on a farm for one photo op. Rural people understand economic power and the grip it has on lawmakers. We know reform isn't easy. A big step forward for Democrats would be to champion antitrust enforcement and challenge the anti-competitive practices of the gigantic agribusiness firms that squeeze our communities. In his rural plan, Biden pledged to strengthen antitrust enforcement, but the term doesn't appear until the 35th bullet point. For rural voters, antitrust enforcement is a top priority, and it should be coupled with policies to manage oversupply in commodity markets so farmers can get a fair price. Another step forward would be an ambitious federal plan in the spirit of the New Deal's Rural Electrification Act to bring high-speed internet to every corner of America. End quote. Some specifics there. I hear you, Sean. You go ahead and start there, former Mayor Hogan. Go ahead.
That is spot on. I mean, last evening we had a Democratic Party chairman's Zoom call with Jay Jacobs, and that was the basic conversation. A lot of that was, we talked about broadband. Where's the broadband for our rural counties and the expansion of broadband and to rural America, where a lot of communities within a stone's throw of us don't have access to quality high-speed broadband. Those issues are greatly, and that's what we talk about messaging. We've lost the message. I don't believe we have lost, all efforts to abandon the Democratic Party principles in rural America. I do not believe that for 1 minute. It's about the messaging that we put forth, and that is so spot on what the guy from Wisconsin just said, that we have to start playing the game in the trenches and expressing, I said earlier in my comments about rural electrification, highlight what we have done. And I think we have to return to the messaging that we are the party of the working family and highlight those issues and do what needs to be done to get that messaging out there. I live in a county that's been totally controlled by Republicans for well over 100 years. And I ask people all the time, okay, you've had the majority Republican rule in Steuben County. Well, how's that working out for you? Is your life better today? And to invariably, people say no. And I've also used the word, there's a psychological term called learned helplessness. And sometimes people just give up. They don't feel that they deserve a better life. They don't feel that we should have the same internet services as someone else, or our roads don't deserve to be paid. And it learns helplessness. There was Jamie Harrison, the senator that just lost in South Carolina. He told a poignant story about knocking on the door, and the elderly gentleman answers the door, and he says, he went to introduce himself. He says, I know who you are. And he said, you see that dirt road you walked down here? Well, it was a dirt road during Reagan. It was a dirt road during Bush, dirt road during Clinton, dirt road during Bush, and a dirt road during Obama. It's still a dirt road. What has the government done for me? And how is my life better through all those administrations? And that's the message to rural America. We have to do better, whether it's Republican or Democrat, but right now it's Democrats. We have to do better with our service to rural America, and rural America has been abandoned.
Okay. Leslie Danks Burke.
I agree with Sean. I think Jerry Lynn and I agree, too, that, and it sounds like the caller writer from Wisconsin agrees, that antitrust and breaking up the big corporate stranglehold on America is one way to go about this. I also think it's tremendously important to notice that that's how the Democratic Party builds its base in urban communities, too, is to reach out to the folks among us who are getting screwed by the system and talk about how we can make it better. So it's not really a different message for rural America as for urban America. It's just the Democrats have to show up in rural America and provide that message. You can't just show up on Election Day and expect folks to listen.
Well, you also can't just promise. You can't just promise to do things. I feel like I don't know, Evan, if you saw the Netflix film Hillbilly Elegy. I went ahead and watched it this weekend, and it made me mad. And I think it's a really good
mad too.
Yeah, it was a really good example of how the coastal elites are not really actually going to the place that they're trying to describe. Politicians can be accused of the same thing, because my parents, to answer Leonard's comment, and I believe I know Leonard, they're the same type of people he just described. They're complete opposite of me politically, and yet even they in the 1970s voted for Democrats for Governor Jim Hunt. So I called my mom after watching Hillbilly Elegy, and I asked her why she voted for Jim Hunt, and she said he actually came out and spoke to us about the things that we needed, and we thought he would do something about it. So I really feel like it's that old Clinton phrase, it's the economy, stupid. There's nothing left in the rural areas for people to have as a way of living. It's a hunger economy, and when you have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her Green New Deal, if you're struggling to put food on the table, if you are unemployed, the last thing you're worried about, I'm sorry, is the environment. You're worried about getting food in your children's mouths.
So, all right, so let's talk about this then, and I'll start with you on this, Jerry Lynn Sparks. Go back across the panel here. When anybody is engaged in sort of a debate, an argument, I think it's vital, and we don't do this enough, and I don't do this enough, it's vital to be able to articulate what the opposition really believes, as opposed to creating a caricature. And I realize Leslie's point, and others have made the point, that sometimes Democrats feel like they're battling a caricature in rural America of what Democrats are versus what Democrats would like to accomplish. I understand that. But I want to ask you, what do you think conservative rural voters value most? And can Democrats reach across and share, or at least not only make sense of those values, but make policies that reflect those values? Jerry Lynn Sparks, let me start with you.
So my experience of the conservative rural voters is it will be very difficult for Democrats with their current platform to get those voters. Many of them have abortion as one of the reasons that they vote for Republicans, and it's their single issue. And they won't vote for anything else. It's what they hear. So I think that's going to be really difficult for them. And I don't think that we have, in at least my lifetime, very many Democrats who are conservatives left. That seems to have gone the generation before me. So we don't seem to have that. Bill Clinton maybe was the closest to that. We just don't seem to have that as part of our party. Okay,
and for the economic side of values, for rural voters generally, where do you think sort of a sweet spot of economic values are, and can Democrats appeal to that, Jerry Lynn Sparks?
Yes, I think if we were to make a focus on bringing back manufacturing jobs and look at the tax base, because taxes are another big issue economically. That is something that really gets the conservative Republican voter fired up. But we haven't done that. And I really do feel like, the manufacturing sector, bringing that back, and not in a return to the past, but like Sean said, with, high-tech infrastructure and the broadband, there's manufacturing associated with that. And then looking at the way we tax and make it more equitable. Right now you have the richest people getting richer, and it's actually not a Democratic thing. It's a Republican thing, in my opinion, but no one's actually changing it. So I think those are some issues to look at as well.
Leslie Danks Burke, what do you think conservative and I don't want to conflate conservative with rural. I mean, I know there are rural progressive voters and rural Democrats, rural conservatives, rural Republicans. But generally speaking, what are the kinds of values you hear from voters who are maybe suspicious of Democrats, and how do you appeal to those values?
Yeah, I just spent a year talking with those voters and trying to convince them to vote for me. And like I said, when I had a chance to talk with them, more likely than not, they decided to vote for me. I don't think that it's about ideology. When you look at the Trump base, it's about people who feel neglected by the elite leadership of both parties. So they gravitate toward a guy who lies all the time, but he tells them they're right to be pissed off about the fact that no one cares about them or listens to them.
Yep, and he's anti-elite, even though he is technically wealthy and among the elite. I mean, he's never really been part of the elite mainstream.
Exactly.
He's been sort of a mockery. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I don't think that I think we really conflate rural and conservative and Republican into one ball of wax at our peril. I don't think they are the same thing at all. Mm-hmm. And I think that once you get out there and you talk with folks, you discover, like Jerry Lynn's saying and like Sean is saying, that actually they gravitate to the progressive Democratic view. You take healthcare, for example. Here in a pandemic, it's as obvious as a kick in the pants that the system is seriously out of whack. Health insurance companies are making billions more in profits this year than they did in previous years. Pharma companies are raking it in. And at the same time, you see hospitals overloaded. You see supply chains groaning under the pressure. You see hundreds of thousands of people dying and families going bankrupt because of healthcare costs. So there's no way that the system works. And Democrats have the right solution. We have a universal care solution. Most people agree with that solution. We should stop there. We should stop trying to package that solution up with, fancy bows and ribbons and describe it as socialized medicine and everything else, because we've won. We've won on the argument. We just have to get out there and make that pitch.
Okay. Do you, Jerry Lynn Sparks, before I ask Mayor Hogan for his thoughts on this, let me just ask you if you think that healthcare is maybe a bigger issue than maybe even a lot of people realize, because Leslie is saying that's a big one. I mean, you pointed to some social issues. Abortion's a big one. I realize that. But is healthcare an opening point for progressives?
Yes, it absolutely is. So my folks, where they live, they have to travel an hour to get to a decent hospital. If there is something major, they have to go all the way to Winston-Salem for heart surgery or to see a specialist. Here in the rural area where I live in, there's actually very few mental health providers, and the ones that are here don't take the type of insurance that most people have. So there's access to health care. And then even in clinical trials, you have great difficulty in participating in all this COVID-19 research. The rural people, it's hard to get to these hospitals for this. So there's a huge problem with access, and then having doctors that actually are trained or in a specialty in those regions. So healthcare is a big thing, in addition to education. And just having access to good education institutions, which starts the cycle of poverty, and it continues. I had to move away from there to get a really good education, to get a really good job, and to have access to all the amenities. I ended up in Los Angeles. I didn't have to go that far, but I actually, as a result of the NAFTA and the decimation of all the factories, go away. And when I had to have my eyes looked at, there was no eye doctor in town. So yeah, it's a big part.
But Jerry, my sense is that, tell me if I'm reading or understanding your position correctly here, that you see, broadly speaking, a lot of rural voters as having said, okay, we voted primarily for Democrats in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s. We didn't like what we got. We didn't feel listened to. We didn't see any meaningful change. So we've been voting for Republicans since then, and things haven't really improved. And what we really feel like is now what we want to do is just break the system and stick it to the elites, because, nobody listens to us. And what we want to do is elect the person who drives all of you crazy, because if our life can't get better by electing qualified people in either party, we can make yours worse. I mean, is that what Trump is, do you think?
I don't think that it's the majority of voters. Most of the people that I know voted for Trump said they did it as they held their nose. They didn't like who he was as a person. They didn't like the way he treated women, but they really felt like he was somebody speaking and fighting for the things that they cared about. Donald Trump, I personally am not a fan of, but if you look at the way he lasered in on what their vulnerabilities were, and he manipulated and took that as an opportunity, and it worked for the first time he got elected. So I do think my rural friends, they're not these, spiteful people. They're, like I said, it's a hunger economy. And I really felt like they feel like right now that the Republicans, have what they want. And it may be not true, but as Sean said, there's a better messaging out there. But I don't think my fellow rural family members or neighbors are voting out of spite. They feel unheard.
Okay. I mean, I think it's I'm not trying to frame it as it's just spider anger, but a sort of dissatisfaction with elites in both major parties for many, many decades. So
that is true. Yes, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Oh, no. I think you're making an important point and an important nuance point. Mayor Hogan, what do you think?
Well, I think we all come right back to it. I'm looking at rural. I'm in the ruralest of rural areas there, and so was Leslie. I looked at Allegheny County. I looked at Steuben County. A lot of reasons why they don't have economic development in those communities is because they have no infrastructure. They have no, centralized water treatment facilities. They have no water pollution control plants. And so they are very limited to attracting the heavy industry, which we were talking about earlier. I know something about that. Hornell has been the fastest growing community in New York State, and that's only a 2% population growth. We have new housing starts. We have, and it's all because of in 1997 we recruited a French firm here, Alstom, who is involved in the transit business. But because of their success, and they're building the next generation high-speed rail system here for Amtrak. They employ over 1,000 people, but they have ancillary industries that are co-suppliers to them, which are growing. We're talking about building another new factory here. So we are doing it here, and we're in the heart of Republican of the Republican world. So I know that we can respond through positive economic developments, and we can look to our successes in healthcare. Hornell is the site of one of the only new hospitals built in New York State in generations. It just opened last March, St. James Hospital, and we did that with the support of New York State. So our message is being heard, but there's too much. The Republicans have become so good at highlighting and coming up with phrases and issues that divide us. So there's no, I would say, common message. There's no united message about moving our rural area forward. It can be done. It has been done. But what you've got the political elites that depend upon their political offices, and how they maintain those political offices is to create the divisions. And like I said earlier, how long have you heard about the two New Yorks in New York State, and that there should be, we should separate from New York City and their urban counties. The most recent proposal by rural Republicans was to split New York into 3 states. And none of them are going to go anywhere, and they're failed policies to begin with, and they don't understand that our economy in New York State has been driven by metropolitan New York and the financial industry for years, and that's how we fund our schools and we fund our hospitals. But they will play upon that division, and they will do that to the detriment of the people that live in these regions. So it's just a vicious cycle, and we as Democrats, we as political leaders, have to break that chain and get the truth out to the people about what they've been. They're in almost like the Twilight Zone, because nothing ever gets better, but they're hearing the same messages.
All right, let's take our own. I got to take our only break, and then we're going to come back. We'll have plenty more time for our guests to respond to that, and we've got a lot of feedback from phone calls and emails we'll try to get through. You're hearing Sean Hogan, a former mayor of Hornell and the current chair of the Steuben County Democratic Committee. Leslie Danks Burke, a regional public advocate and former candidate for New York State Senate. Jerry Lynn Sparks, a former congressional press secretary, founder of the Riga Democratic Committee. Talking about the problems that Democrats have in rural America and what might change that. We're right back after this only break. I'm Evan Dawson. Monday on The Next Connections, we examine pandemic pods or quarantine bubbles, or whatever the term is you use to describe how you've structured who you see up close and who you don't. The pods can be helpful for sure, but doctors and epidemiologists warn that they are porous, and there are a lot of things to keep in mind as we plan for the rest of this pandemic, and we'll do that on Monday. This is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Let me get some of your phone calls. Stephanie in Pittsford first. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, Evan. Thanks so much for taking my call.
Sure.
I really think, as an elected Democrat, that every elected official, leader, and activist in my party needs to read the Atlantic and Politico articles that you referenced, because this isn't only about the electoral math. It's about the people we're leaving out and leaving behind. This is an issue that personally I'm passionate about because my parents grew up on Midwest farms, and I lived with my grandparents on their farm in high school. And so my family has directly felt the impact in rural communities of being abandoned politically, economically, and educationally. You were speaking earlier, and your guests were speaking about how do we do this? Is this messaging or is this the platform? And for me, I think it's that we as Democrats have to connect our platform and policies to the needs of rural communities. So as we build a green economy, we have to bring those jobs to rural areas. As we address immigration, we have to ensure that farms are able to legally hire the workers they need. As we make healthcare more affordable, we have to make it accessible to rural residents. And in terms of agriculture, one thing that I think here in Monroe County that people need to remember is that agriculture issues impact directly our county. We have more than 140,000 acres of farmland in Monroe County. And we have to be working with our local farms, which are largely small and family owned, as partners in our economy and in environmental protection and conservation. So I see a lot of opportunities for the Democratic platform and policies to be supporting rural communities and to, as Sean said, address the issue of how are you going to make my life better?
Okay. Jerry Lynn Sparks, let me start with you on that one. Go ahead.
So I agree with the caller. I think that it speaks to what Leslie and I were also saying earlier. The policies are empty rhetoric unless you're actually got actions behind them, and that's basically the theme of what the rural voters are saying. There's no action behind these platforms. You can come out and have a photo op all you want, but if we don't prioritize the rural voters, then they're going to turn their backs on us, and that's exactly what we saw. You have, like that article in Politico said, you have a sea of red with blue dots here and there, and we have to take a look at the foundation of what the rural economy is, which is pretty crumbling right now, and strengthen it, or we're never going to get them back.
Leslie Danks Burke.
So, Evan, I want to emphasize the point that you were starting to make before the break, and that I think the caller also was talking about, which is this a question of folks wanting to have enough to provide for their own families, and when they look down the block, they see that other families are also struggling? Is there a competition going on there? I think that's a very key point that we have to wrap into this conversation. And we also have to recognize that we live in the richest country in the world, and we're in the richest state in that country. So there's no scarcity of resources here. And when we tell people that they live in a community of scarce resources, it generates fear and it generates competition. What Sean describes that he did in Hornell, expanding the growth opportunities, building the new hospital, bringing, Alstom in to create 1,000 jobs, he did that in the poorest county in the state. And that's important to recognize that we can build. There's real opportunity here. We can do it even in the poorest county in the state. Take a look at the agenda that the Patriotic Millionaires is advancing on Wall Street, for example. They're saying, look, we're people who have made our living off of Wall Street investments. We're people who have made our living, made millions, billions in some cases, off of the commerce that New York State brings to the country. Tax us more. Get that money flowing into the economy, because that's how you're going to build a better system for everyone. We've got to start looking at the opportunities for resources that we have.
Well, and former Mayor Hogan, on that note, when you look at resources and what the policies of both party focus on, author Chris Arnade makes the argument that it's really not about just rural and urban America, but he thinks Democratic Party policies for years have focused on what he calls front row in all parts of America, rural, urban, et cetera. What he means by that is, an obsession with PhDs and higher education, policies that indicate that that's the career path that works and that that's the future, as opposed to understanding different ways of life, a desire for dignity that might not include higher ed, and a path to success with the necessary supports that don't just favor sort of those who are already middle class, upper middle class. Do you agree with that, Sean? And,
I think we have the party, the party elite. Our leadership has become somewhat of an elitist party with, focusing on those at the upper echelon of education and things of that nature. And what we need, I'll give you an example. I'm working with an employer now. We need qualified welders. Well, try to find qualified welders. I mean, they're scarcer than hen's teeth. So, those are some of the things we should be promoting, that people can have a good life with by going to Wellsville, Alfred State College campus, and learning a trade, become a plumber or a diesel mechanic and a welder. Because if we are going to rebuild our economy, rebuild our manufacturing, we need that type of employment base. Not everyone is going to be able to go to college and get a master's degree or a PhD, but people can go to the vocational schools and vocational colleges and get great skills to be very competitive in our workforce today. You ask anybody involved in economic development, one of the biggest things that we have today is people are qualified to even go into the basic entry-level manufacturing job. They can't read a ruler. They can't read a blueprint. Those are some of the things we should be talking about and promoting in rural America, because we aren't educating our students appropriately or properly to meet the demands of the new generation, the new manufacturing workforce.
I want to get Jack's phone call in a second. I want to get an email from Charles, but real briefly, I hate to do this, but can I ask all three of our guests just to maybe briefly describe whether they're up or down, if they had a hand in a couple of different policies that our listeners have been asking about? Jerry Lynn Sparks, loan debt forgiveness. Yes or no?
I think that maybe a cap on how much, because some people have a lot. I'm put on the spot here, so I'd have to think and do some research on that. I am somewhat for it, but I think there's also an underlying sense of responsibility. So perhaps a cap on how much could be forgiven. Okay,
with limits. And the listeners also asking about defund the police. Jerry Lynn Sparks.
Oh, I absolutely am a strong supporter of our law enforcement. They help save my life and my children's life. I think there's a way to have community conversations with the police without defunding them. I think there's certainly a lot of hurt and pain that's gone on, but I don't think that we want to defund our police because of what's going to happen when you call 911.
Is that issue hurting Democrats in rural America?
Oh, yeah, I definitely think it is, just from my own observation.
Okay, Leslie Danks Burke, I'll work backwards then. Defund the police. Did that issue hurt you in the campaign? Is it hurting Democrats in rural America?
The way Democrats are choosing to talk about it hurts Democrats in rural America. And here's the thing. I am not in favor of removing funding from our police departments. And the reason is because our police departments already understand the problem that we're facing. We cannot tie increased social services or the elimination of systemic racism to police department funding. Systemic racism is a massive problem in America, and until we get to the bottom of the race problem in America, I think we're stymied from grappling with a lot of the other economic challenges that we have. And that's a conversation that should not be tied to funding for police departments.
Okay, loan debt forgiveness?
Yeah. Anything that gets money back into the pockets of Americans right now in a recession, I'm all in favor of. Okay. Let's get money into working families' pockets and get them to start spending that money out there in our local businesses. Let's put a cap on how much our big, huge corporations can profiteer off the pandemic, and let's get America working again.
Sean Hogan, loan debt forgiveness, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Defund the police. Does that hurt you in rural areas like yours?
It certainly hurt us. It was the most insane term ever created, and it did irreparable damage to the Democratic candidates up and down the ballots this past election cycle. And we should distance ourselves from that phrase. I'm not saying that we can't work and have conversations with our law enforcement officials and to make things better for them and for the people they serve, but that was a totally asinine term that was floated out there.
All right, let's get Jack from Greece on the phone. Keep it tight. Go ahead, Jack.
Hi, Evan. Thank you. Hey, I'll try and speak quickly because I know you're running out of time. I want to make a few. By the way, if Mayor Hogan, if things ever open up and we can have a coffee or a beer together, I'd love to chat with you. I agree with the message that you're sending here. Evan, I think we've heard President Obama and Jim Clyburn, the congressman from I think South Carolina, make the message clear that defund the police and socialism hurts the Democratic Party in terms of messaging, and I agree with that 100%. I remember Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio having problems with Anastasio Cortez when they were fighting over Amazon jobs coming into New York City area. And I think it's interesting because I've been exchanging emails with my sister and a cousin of mine who lives in California, talking about the Democrats seem to be a herd of cats, where everybody's got an opinion and they all want to fight with each other. Who could be the most, message the most liberal message? But the Republicans are more like, a pack of wolves, where they stay together and they're disciplined and focused. They focus on the goal of winning. The Democrats, they're so quick to say, well, if you're not liberal enough, I'm not going to support you. I think I listen to Rahm Emanuel, and I resonate with his message also, where you got to focus on the goal is to win. Then you can talk about how far do we need to go on health care. But the Democratic positions, in my opinion, are so much more focused on helping each other versus just helping yourself. I think the message on that Trump focused on of grievance and jobs being outsourced, that really came more from the Republican side, the outsourcing. I watched it happen. The outsourcing came more from that side than the Democratic side. But the Democrats get caught up in a poor messaging, I think. So anyway, I could go on further, but I agree with Governor Hogan. Need to clean up the messaging so that you win. You got to win.
Yeah, Jack, thank you very much. And Sean, you got a promotion to governor. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Former mayor. I thank you, Jack, for the phone call. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dovetail Charles's email in, and I'll let our guests make some final thoughts, because Jack is making a comment about messaging. So is Charles. Charles is saying that he says, maybe I'm just spitballing here, but maybe rural voters would be more interested in supporting Democrats if those who identify as Democrats weren't constantly talking about people in rural America being too stupid to know this or that they should give up their guns, that their votes shouldn't count if X, Y, and Z. Charles is saying that liberals too often pillory and make fun and mock rural voters, and that is to their detriment as well. Jerry Lynn Sparks, what do you think?
Well, as a former press secretary who's involved in messaging, I agree that we have really failed in the messaging. I think there's an elitist attitude when we say, the Democrats or the rural voters are voting against their own interests, because there's a lot of arrogance implied in that statement. One of the things that Republicans do successfully is utilize fear, and fear is a great motivator, and so they've taken that and run with it. To use a little bit of a lyric from the Eagles, you don't know how to go where you don't already know how to go. There's fear that is causing people to move the way they are at the voting booth, and I think the only way to combat fear is through knowledge and getting the message out there correctly. And also, why don't we start putting on the candidate list nationally rural Democratic candidates? Why don't we get people who are actually from those areas instead of having elite people,
That's
represent?
a thought. There's a thought. Leslie Danks Burke, 30 seconds. Go ahead.
You got it. So Democrats have the right solutions, but they're overthinking the packaging. And here's the analogy. If you're getting your friend the best Christmas present they could possibly ever want, and then you spend all your time trying to make your friend look at the fancy wrapping paper instead of at the present. We gotta make sure we're actually getting our agenda out there to talk about. Folks want exactly the progressive agenda. People want FDR's freedom from fear and freedom from want, but folks simply do not have time for all the elitist fluff that's packaged around it.
I appreciate this conversation. And listeners, again, in the coming days, we're going to talk to Republicans about how they can win in larger cities, which they used to do and don't really do anymore. Sort of a mirror of the conversation here. Leslie Danks Burke, a regional public advocate who ran for New York State Senate. Thanks for making the time. Let's stay in touch. I know we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Sean Hogan, are you running for governor? You want to break any news?
No, not running for governor. But I appreciate having the opportunity to be on the call.
Thank you, sir. The former mayor of Hornell, current chair of the Steuben County Democrats, and Jerry Lynn Sparks, founder of the Riga Democratic Committee. Thank you, Jerry Lynn.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Wonderful conversation with them. Rob Braden, engineer, Megan Mack, producer. I'm Evan Dawson. We'll talk with you on Monday.